So we're about to go into our final plenary for the morning before lunch, which is an amazing session. Fuchsia Dunlop has been cooking multiple ducks' tongues in order to tell you about Chinese offal, and Peter Hertzmann also has a very exciting presentation called It's All Edible. But first, I have really nice, surprising news. I didn't know that Theodore Zeldin was going to come. For those of you who've never been to the symposium before, Theodore is the original symposiast. He was the co-creator of the very, very first symposium with Alan Davidson. And I just wondered if you just wanted to say hello and a couple of words.
Yes. Well, we started this at a time when gastronomy was not a subject thought of as being serious. And when I proposed it to the governing body of St. Anthony's College, they all smiled, but I happened to be dean at the time. And so I was able to carry permission, and I got Alan Davidson given some money so that he could pursue his studies, and that we got together and did something which people thought was a joke. And now it's 35 years later, it is no longer funny, which is a great pity. But it's really remarkable that we are now having so many young people taking food seriously and seeing all the new problems that food is creating in the world, on which we ought to be saying what we want to say. And I was glad that we also had our say on the recent referendum, where we lost.
We had our say, but they didn't listen.
But we showed that we were interested in the whole world, and that we are people who are not stuck in our habits, but want to invent and discover and relate to people all over the world. And that has been the great achievement of this symposium, that we get people of all nationalities to come here. So I'm delighted that we have, I see one of our first supporters is sitting in front of me, actually still here. So I wish you many happy returns.
Oh, thank you. And before passing on to Fuchsia and Peter, I just had two tiny little sort of housekeeping points. One is that I've just been asked to, some people in the amazing Jennifer McLagan talk on blood didn't catch where in the world it was that Jennifer was buying her blood. It's in Toronto. So that's just to confirm that. And secondly, the book room. You have very few chances left to go and browse and buy on the bookstores if you still want to do so. Prospect books are only here until 1 o'clock. I don't want to make anyone rush away from this plenary session, but if you did have your eye on a prospect book, now is the time. Bloomsbury and Reaction, they'll be closed over lunch, but they'll reopen before the 3 o'clock session, so you'll have another chance then. But thank you. Over to you.
Okay, is the voice coming through? Yep. Great. Okay, so I've actually lobbied for this talk since 5 o'clock Sunday last year. I wanted to present a butcher's view, or more of a meat industry view, of what offal is in the real world today. And it breaks down essentially into 4 sections. What I've done actually, if you've looked at my paper, you see it's fairly long. It's actually a synopsis of what could easily be a book. I'm going to show you a video, which is really the trailer for the paper. Okay, it's for for those of my generation, it's called Previews of Coming Attractions. So in order to put as much information as I could, as fast as I could, I decided to do it as a video. But I wanted to point out, it's broken down into 4 sections. terminology, which is what, from an industrial standpoint, what we look at as offal, and we're talking about meat offal in this case, the identification of what all the different parts of the animal that fit into that. Thirdly is the morphology, or what is the tissue types that make up the different offals. So when you were eating the tripe the other night, I don't know whether you thought about that as smooth muscle and an involuntary muscle, but that's actually what it is. And the fourth and the most important part, and unfortunately the shortest in this, is the practicalities. Why do you have to go to Toronto to buy blood? Why can't you buy, whatever part you want at your local market, things like that. So we'll see how this, and if all the technological gods line up. When I use the word offal, what do I mean? The third edition of the Oxford English Dictionary provides a total of 7 definitions for the noun form of offal. These can be divided into 2 groups, one that refers to waste and one that refers to animal parts. If you believe, which I don't, that non-muscle animal parts are trash, then all definitions refer to some form of waste. I'm interested mostly in definition 2a. Let's dissect it and look at each of the 3 sentences separately. First, the edible parts collectively which are cut off in preparing the carcass of an animal for food. Let's do some further dissection and look at the 4 important phrases in this sentence. The phrase edible parts was added to the definition in the 2004 update. It was not specified in the previous edition. I assume that in this usage, edible simply means fit to be eaten, and personal and cultural preferences do not enter into the picture. The phrase cut off is very important to distinguish this definition from a common belief that when a carcass is opened along the ventral midline, all the viscera exits the body on its own. In reality, all the viscera is attached to the carcass at multiple places. To remove it requires transecting the attachments using pulling or cutting. Nothing falls off on its own. From a butcher standpoint, the phrase preparing the carcass is interesting. In the earlier edition, the expression used was dressing the carcass. The normal butchery term applied after the animal is slaughtered and bled. For any large food animal, when this step is completed, the carcass is ready to be consumed in only the broadest of definitions. The phrase animal for food distinguishes these animal parts, which are being harvested for food, from similar parts found in carrion or the family pet. The last phrase, really just a term, was added in the recent update. The addition of collectively is a subtle way of declaring that offal is similar to a collective noun. It is a mass noun in that it is generally uncountable. I can't go to the butcher and purchase 6 offals. The third sentence of this OED definition claims that there are exceptions where offal can be used as a count noun, but I find it hard to imagine finding the phrase, a piece of offal, in a recipe. In this discussion, I propose an alternative definition which includes all parts of an animal which do not consist primarily of skeletal muscle and are used raw or minimally processed as an ingredient of a prepared product. This is essentially saying the same as the edible parts collectively which are cut off in preparing the carcass of an animal for food, but since most people are unaware of what parts are harvested during the dressing of the carcass, I feel some clarification is helpful. Also, not all carcasses are dressed by every producer the same way. The list of items removed during dressing will vary. In addition, some offal, such as tendons, can only be harvested from a dressed carcass and are thus excluded in the OED definition. There are some items like tongue, skirt, and cheek that are primarily skeletal meat, but are still considered offal because they are not part of the dressed carcass. The second sentence of the OED definition tells us that in early usage, the word only referred to the entrails, but today it is the head, tail, and internal organs such as the heart, liver, etc. This list has obvious omissions, but I assume it was meant to symbolically encompass all items referred to as offal. As we'll see in the second part of the video, the list can be extensive. Any list of offal will have issues. The first issue is completeness. Many lists only include those items consumed within the entity referred to by the list. For example, a current list in the United States will not include lungs, whereas other countries' lists will. There is also the issue of fabrication. Some lists, because they are intended for use in commercial sales, distinguish between the different ways of trimming an item. Others ignore these differences. Since some items of offal are only harvestable in certain age or certain sex animals, lists need to account for these differences. Not all do. Lists also require differentiation by animal type, since ruminant stomachs, for example, are very different from non-ruminant stomachs. To make commercial lists more manageable, they are usually divided by animal species. I think it is easier to discuss offal if the list is divided, as much as possible, by 5 of the functional systems and 3 auxiliary categories. The functional systems are the nervous system, the vascular system, the digestive system, the respiratory system, the urogenital system. The 3 categories are skin and membranes, muscles and fat, and none of the above. Let's look at what items fit into each category. To further simplify the listing, the only animals I will be concerned with at this point are cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. The only item in the nervous system that we eat is the brain. Since the advent of BSE, many countries do not allow the sale of any part of a bovine brain, and meat cuts that include portions of the vertebral column must be stripped of any remnants of the spinal cord. The principal items of the vascular system that are eaten are the heart and the spleen. The heart may be sold as part of the pluck, which consists of the liver, heart, lungs, trachea, and a portion of the diaphragm. In a butcher's case, it's most likely to find a heart as a single, whole organ, although it is available wholesale stripped of all its connective tissue. The digestive system is responsible for most of the edible parts from the 4 animals under discussion. Cattle, sheep, and goats are ruminants whose digestive systems differ considerably from pigs. The tongue is available in numerous trim specifications, and all of the trim is also for sale. The salivary gland and aspects of the esophagus are available in some countries. Ruminant stomachs are divided into 4 chambers, which are cleaned, scalded, and bleached to make various forms of tripe. Non-ruminant stomachs are just cleaned, trimmed, and scalded. The liver and pancreas are usually sold whole at the commercial level. The intestines are sold whole or in parts and trimmed to order. Not all parts of the intestine from each of the animal are saleable. The only 2 food items in the respiratory system are the lungs and the trachea. Similar to the heart, the lungs may be sold as part of the pluck. The urogenital system includes kidneys, which are usually sold whole. These and the testes are the only parts in this category generally available from all 4 types of animals. The penis and mammary glands are generally only available from cattle. Bladders, ovaries, and uteri are only available from pigs. Offal derived from the skin is generally only harvested from pigs. Lists may include the skin as a general item or specific items like the ears, the lips, the snout, and the mask, which is the skin covering the skull. Cattle ears are available in some countries, but they must be denuded before sale. Membranes removed during the trimming of cattle offal may also be saleable. The first item in the category of muscles and fat is the diaphragm. This consists of a ring of muscle called skirt surrounding a dome-shaped piece of tendon. Pork skirts are sold as offal, whereas beef skirts are sold as standard meat cuts, even though they are cut directly from the carcass during dressing. The caul fat is a thin covering over the omentum and usually only harvested from pigs. The clear plate is pork fatback. Abdominal fat is usually only used from cattle and pigs, where it is sometimes referred to as leaf fat. Leaf fat from cattle is also called suet. There's also fat from the flank, as well as the fatty covering of the mesentery. The 2 bones with accessible marrow are the femur and the humerus. The shafts of these bones are usually sawn into sections to expose the marrow, which is primarily fat in mature animals. In the miscellaneous category, there's the head, either whole for pigs or just the extracted meat in the case of cattle. The neck bones, after the meat is trimmed, are another piece of offal. The feet from cattle and pigs are available, with pigs' feet containing more of the leg. Cattle and pigtails are quite different, but both are available in a number of forms. The tendons from the lower legs of cattle, as well as certain ligaments, are available, although the tendons tend to be for humans to chew on and the ligaments for dogs to chew on. Blood is available at the consumer level with just the fibrin removed and as components on the wholesale market. The last item is the thymus gland, which is commonly called sweetbreads, and is sold with all the surrounding fat and connective tissue either intact or removed. The body consists of 5 types of tissue: muscle, connective, nervous, epithelial, and mineralized. We eat all types except for the mineralized, which we reserve for lesser animal forms or the garden. Skeletal muscle, the type I specified in my definition of offal, is one of the 3 types of muscle. The other 2 are heart and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is the voluntary muscle that contracts and relaxes when an animal walks, runs, chews, or swats a fly. This type of muscle is well perfused with blood, so it appears red or pink. The muscles of the head and tail are skeletal muscle. Heart muscle is similar, but it is involuntary muscle. It contracts and relaxes in a continuous rhythm from an animal's birth until a short while after it dies. Smooth muscle is also involuntary muscle, but it is poorly supplied with blood, which gives it a light color and a bland flavor. It used to be referred to as white muscle. Smooth muscle is a major component of the digestive system and is responsible for moving food in its various digestive states from the entry point to past the exit. The three types of connective tissue are fibers, ground substance, and cells. Fibers can further be classified into elastic, reticular, and collagenous. In one simplistic view, connective tissue binds and supports the body together. In the case of tendons, it's collagen fibers that attach muscles to bone. Nervous tissue, the third type mentioned above, enables a response to stimuli and coordinates bodily functions. It is consumed in the form of brains. Epithelial tissue covers the exterior body as skin and lines the interior surfaces, such as the peritoneal cavity, as peritoneum. All glands form from an ingrowth of an epithelial surface. The availability of offal to the consumer is nearly a perfect model of supply and demand. In this case, the model is modified by ethnic shrinking, marketplace changes, fads, government regulations, slaughterhouse, restaurant, and butcher practicalities, and lastly, non-edible competition. Ethnic shrinking happens when a market created by first-generation immigrants demanding foods similar to those of their homeland ages to accommodate a second generation that has assimilated and eats less of the foods of their parents. Marketplace changes also occur when long-established groups select newer, more convenient foods or when fads temporarily take over a small but significant part of purchase decisions. Government regulations affect how animals are slaughtered and processed. All parts that are eviscerated or cut from the carcass must be kept aligned with the carcass until it passes inspection. If the carcass fails inspection, the offal must be destroyed or separated for non-human purposes. Governments also decide what parts of an animal are suitable for human consumption. What's legal in one country may be forbidden in another. The ability of an individual slaughterhouse to fabricate individual offal items is often a function of scale. Each animal has a fixed number of harvestable parts, and in case of any unique part may be more than a small facility produces in a single day. The output from a slaughterhouse will never perfectly match demand. At times, the offal output will exceed orders. When this occurs, the processed offal, since it is more perishable than skeletal muscle, must be frozen and stored until it can be sold. The issues for restaurants and butcher shops are similar. They both need to be able to obtain a sufficient product to sell while at the same time ensuring they sell it before it spoils. They are often required by suppliers to purchase case lots which are impractical for a particular business size. If less than case quantities are available, the chef or butcher may have to pay a substantially higher unit price for the same item. The components of many animal parts go into dietary supplements, pharmaceutical drugs, cosmetics, household cleaning products, clothing, footwear, and many other items in common use. Some of the uses, such as leather from hides, trace back millennia. Others, such as extracting estrogen and progesterone from bovine ovaries, are more recent. Some of the non-food uses are so profitable that for many large processors, there is more income to be made from byproducts than from skeletal muscle. Offal is more than just a listing of strange parts of animals used for foods. It is also a reflection on our individual backgrounds, our relationships with the government, and the practicalities of conducting business.
Duck tongues. What's the point of eating a duck's tongue? If you're not Chinese or possibly Southeast Asian, it's a very reasonable question. Tiny, fiddly little things, no meat to speak of, just a bit of flubbery tissue, a few bony things that you have to extract. So really a pointless exercise. And this is how they're often served in China, with this forked, bony structure on the back at the root. The typical Western view of why the Chinese eat things like duck tongues is very disparaging. That's a 19th century print of a Chinese peddler with rats and puppies for pies. There tends to be a sort of idea that the Chinese eat weird, rubbery things and offals out of poverty and desperation. And you see this sort of theme in sort of views on China throughout the ages. This is Marco Polo in about 1300, noting that the Chinese eat flesh, including dogs and other brute beasts and animals of every kind, which Christians would not touch for anything in the world. The lower orders do not scruple to eat all sorts of unclean flesh. And then 2002, the Daily Mail described Chinese food as the dodgiest in the world, created by a nation which eats bats, snakes, monkeys, bear's paws, bird's nest, shark's fins, duck tongues, and chicken's feet. In general, and with notable regional variations, the Chinese do eat a dazzling range of what most Westerners would consider pretty extreme offal. But the idea that this is the food of desperation is extremely misleading, because although you can find plenty of cucina povera across China and the love of eating what Westerners would consider offcuts and marginal meats, it extends across the social scale. So you get some offal that's low class, like perhaps pig offal eaten at a village feast after a slaughter, but it also graces the highest tables in the country with extraordinary esoteric and expensive delicacies, like shark's fin, you know, a sort of woody bit of cartilage with no flavour, which I think by most Western definitions would be offal, but is one of the most treasured traditional Chinese delicacies. So I just wanted to look briefly at why the Chinese love eating discarded and rejected foods, rejected by the West, like duck tongues. And it's not just for reasons of sort of careful economy, eating everything and minimizing waste, but some specific cultural reasons, some of which have been touched on in other papers about Southeast Asia over this weekend. The first reason is tonic, medicinal reasons. No distinction between food and medicine in China, and so some foods that may be flavourless and not very appealing are eaten for their tonic properties. This is a stag pizzle or penis soup, which I made a couple of years ago, which obviously is an aphrodisiac used to zhuang yang, to boost the yang energy of men. But another major factor is textural appreciation. In Chinese gastronomy, pleasure is derived from the total experience of eating, and you find in descriptions of food that mouthfeel or kogan is inseparable from aroma, appearance, and flavour, and the other things that we, in the West are commonly considered to be part of the pleasure of food. That is a goose intestine, which is about to be dipped into a Sichuan hot pot. So goose intestine, totally flavourless. The first time I ate it, I thought it was like eating rubber bands. But it's got, when you get used to it, this lovely, slippery, snappy texture. So it's very smooth and slippery, and then you bite it, and it has a sort of crunch to its bite. The Chinese particularly adore slithery, slimy, snappy, bouncy, rubbery, and gristly textures, which really kind of a lot of Westerners find revolting. There's a whole vocabulary to describe the textures of food in Chinese, and I've just singled out a few of the most interesting terms. Cui is a lovely word, and it expresses a kind of very abrupt, juicy crispness or crunchiness. So you could apply it to some very firm, juicy cucumber, but also to the crunch of the gristle in a chicken's drumstick, for example, that graunchy, crunchy, snappy sensation. Hua, slippery, smooth, slimy. Slimy doesn't sound very good in English, but that can be lovely if you're having a bird's nest soup, for example. Nor, sticky, huggy, glutinous, things with glutinous rice or a slow-cooked pig's foot. And tansing, which is used to describe a bouncy, elastic quality. So you'd get that in, that stag pizzle, for example, and other sort of rather rubbery foods. And shuang is a sort of a word that is used, I think it's fairly recent, applied to food, but it means bright, crisp, clear, and refreshing in the mouth. So a goose intestine in a sort of sour and hot sauce might be that have that lovely, brisk, refreshing quality in the mouth. This is a description of chicken testicles from a Chinese food encyclopedia, just to show you some of the sort of language of food. So when you eat a chicken's testicle, for example, in a Sichuan hot pot, it's a bit like biting through a membrane, and inside is a chickeny creme caramel, very juicy. And this is how it's described: exquisitely fine and smooth, delicately soft and tender, but with a certain springiness, a very beautiful, juicy flavour and feeling. So you can see the idea of sort of all these sensations together is part of the pleasure of eating such food. And the Chinese, particularly in Sichuan, eat all kinds of really extremely rubbery and textural foods. This is tiantang, paradise, which I had for the first time a couple of years ago. That is the upper palates of pigs. And it's quite hard to chew. It's really gristly crunchy, and it's so sort of gristly and crunchy that it makes a kind of noise in your head when you eat it. And another, that's with a sort of chili oil, a late night snack in Chengdu, and also the cartilage from the throats of cows and pigs, also graunchy, crunchy, rubbery, no flavour, except for the sauce, but great fun when you get into it. The other thing is, my father uses this term grapple factor, which I always use now. In China, it's such a pleasure to eat fiddly and complicated things. The Western reaction is it's not worth grappling with a duck's tongue or chicken's foot. In China, that's part of the pleasure. Rabbit heads stewed in a spiced broth, that's a sort of low-grade Chengdu street snack. Chicken's feet, high grapple factor as well. Duck tongues, a lot of fiddling for the actual meat. And fish heads, which can be a very grand delicacy in China. So right through the social scale, a kind of pleasure in eating complicated things. And I just wanted to say a word about table manners, because I think that when you use chopsticks, it's very easy to pick things apart and not only put things in your mouth, but take them out. In China, it's okay to make a little bit of discreet noise when you eat. It's okay to spit something, a bit of bone or something, out into your bowl. And so, you know, imagine if you serve a fish head at an English dinner party. You can't eat it with knives and forks, and it would provoke terrible social anxiety. You know, what do you do with all these little bones? But it's fine in China, and actually with some things like rabbit heads, you actually get given plastic gloves now, so you can tear into them and suck and spit and all these kind of things. There's another thing that people talk about, a distinction between huorou and sirou, live meat, and dead meat. So dead meat would be like a American factory farm chicken breast, the meat just sitting there. It's got no texture. Live meat would be sort of wings, the tail of the giant big head carp in the Yangtze River, a great delicacy. It's called red braised paddle, hongsha huashui, because of the way it flips through the water and develops that kind of slightly taut, tensile quality, which people like. That's live meat. And some people in the Zhejiang region say that the best bit of a chicken is the jiao tiao fei, the squawk, the jump, and the fly. That's the neck, the feet, and the wings, because they're live meat. And yeah, so once you can appreciate textures and grapple factor, as the Chinese do, you radically extend the possibilities not only of what is edible, but what is pleasurable. And this goes right through the sort of social scene. So at the low end, you get Sichuan hot pot, originally a labourer's dish, sort of labourers on the banks of the Yangtze, heating up some water buffalo offal in a pot full of chilies. And at the high end, you get things like sea cucumber, bird's nest, shark's fin, tasteless, textural foods. The other thing is the pursuit of gastronomic thrills. If you extend the definition of what's edible, you get huge variety. Peking duck restaurants serving a banquet of everything but the quack, everything cooked according to its texture and its qualities and its deficiencies, all treated in the kitchen to make the most of it. And there's also a strain of eating Shanzhen Highway, literally treasures of the mountains and flavors of the seas, exotic ingredients. So people in China, you know, throughout Chinese history really, have enjoyed the cachet of rare and extraordinary ingredients to thrill and honour your guests. Sometimes it's rare and exotic ingredients like bird's nest from Southeast Asia or the rare Tibetan caterpillar fungus. Sometimes rare parts of exotic creatures like bear's paw, shark's fin, but also special parts of more ordinary creatures like duck tongues. This is goose feet. In the past, you can imagine this is the feet of 10 or 12 geese. So what a special thing. You know, just to have goose would be, you know, a treat, really. But to have all those feet, you're really eating at the top table. You've got the best bits. This is a fish head. Again, fantastic textural pleasure, all those sort of creamy, gelatinous, oozy bits, which you can extricate with your tongue and teeth from the little plates and bones and so on. And that's a grand banquet dish in the Yangtze River region. And this is a recreation of the famous Man-Han banquet, bringing together the best of the Manchu and Han culinary skills. This is a recreation of a late 18th century banquet that was thrown in Yangzhou for the Qianlong Emperor. And one of the dishes was bear's paw, surrounded by crucian carp tongues. So bear's paw, a rare part of a rare creature, very rubbery and gelatinous, like a sort of deer's foot, requiring careful cooking. and crucian carp, which is an ordinary but delicious fish, but you've got lots of little tongues, so then it becomes special and it connotes the same honour because there are so few tongues. And this kind of pursuit of exotica is where the noble aspect of nose-to-tail eating, making sure nothing is wasted, eases seamlessly into extravagance and decadence, the crazy pursuit of things like tongues. And throughout Chinese history, food commentators have sort of deplored the sort of decadence and immorality of people who just pursue crazy delicacies instead of being happy with more humble natural foods like tofu and bamboo shoots. Finally, this is one of the most incredible dishes I've ever tasted in sort of 20 years of eating in China. Tubu lulian, catfish basking in honours. Do you see that little catfish which is just there for show around the dish? Well, in the bowl are the cheeks of 200 little fish like that. 400 cheeks, the size of a thumbnail, small dish. This same dish was given to Richard Nixon when he visited Hangzhou in 1972. So you can imagine the feeling in a restaurant, everyone else is having fish soup. You get to eat this incredible dish. Okay, now with the duck tongues, Jane and Helen and Ken, maybe, would you help distribute? So I've cooked a whole lot of duck's tongues. If you're interested in the cooking method, it's a recipe from Wenzhou in Zhejiang province in eastern China. So what I did with them was I bought them in Chinatown frozen. They're all Gressingham duck tongues. So I first boiled them to purge away any sort of rankness, gaminess, particularly important with offal, generally used in Chinese meat cookery. I marinated them overnight, ginger, spring onion, Shaoxing wine, a bit of soy sauce, salt. And then the following day, I fried up ginger and spring onion, added the tongues, water, lots of rock sugar, dark soy sauce, and Shaoxing wine, and a bit of star anise, and then reduced it down to a sort of glaze. Oh, can you wait a minute before you eat them, actually? Sorry, I just wanted to say a couple of things. It's okay. I just wanted to say, with eating them, that I know that some people here are Chinese and probably grew up loving duck's tongues, and some of you have had them before, but I just wanted to invite you, if you haven't had them before, to sort of eat them differently. So a few things to consider. The first thing is, you've got the prized bit. This is not rubbishy offal. This is the finest, choicest morsel. So it's a privilege and an honour to eat it. So try and see it in that way and set aside any ideas you had before. The other thing is, when you put it into your mouth, try to seek pleasure in the texture. Be aware of that gentle, soft, springy rubberiness, and enjoy teasing away the little bit of cartilage and the little bones, maybe crunching a bit of gristle in the root. Try to actually open your mind to the possibility that there is pleasure in these textures and in the grapple. And if you're able to do this, you will find your ability to appreciate Chinese food is just magnified greatly. Thank you.